Chandler Bertram. The Cage. More than 6 months have passed since the interstellar liner Polar Star made an emergency landing on this nameless planet. The landing went quite safely. However, the ship's nuclear reactor soon went out of control, so the captain ordered the first officer to take the passengers and part of the ship's crew, which was not needed during the liquidation of the accident, and take everyone away. When Hawkins and his charges had gone far enough, there was a flash of released energy on the ship and a not particularly strong explosion reached them. After waiting for some time, the first mate, accompanied by Dr. Boyle, the ship's surgeon, returned to the scene of the accident. They saw a shallow, still smoking crater and realized that both the ship and the captain and his people had turned into tiny particles of the luminous cloud that they had observed immediately after the explosion. From that moment on, the 50-odd people from the Polar Star who survived began to gradually degrade. Of course, this did not start immediately. Hawkins and Boyle, with the assistance of a committee composed of the most conscientious passengers, tried to actively prevent this. But the fight was hopeless. The climate of the planet is what particularly influenced them from the very beginning. It was hot, the temperature constantly hovered around 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and humid, an unpleasant drizzle continuously fell from the sky. The air was saturated with spores of some kind of mold, which fortunately did not harm living tissue but violently destroyed all inanimate organic matter, especially clothing. The issue with nutrition resolved itself after the first few hungry hours. Someone voluntarily ate a couple of large juicy mushrooms that grew on the trunks of large fern-like trees. The mushrooms turned out to be quite edible. After about 5 hours passed and no one died or even experienced any stomach troubles, mushrooms became firmly established in the diet of the castaways. Fire. This is what people were missing despite the sweltering heat. If they had a fire, they could diversify their menu by frying frogs caught in the damp forest and fish caught in streams and lakes. Fire was also needed to while away the long dark nights. At first, most people, when they got off the ship, still had matches and lighters, but the former instantly became damp and the latter were lost after the clothes spread along the threads under the influence of mold. The victims set up camp on top of a small hill. Everyone broke branches from tree ferns and built themselves a primitive hut, after which everyone set about establishing social life. With some kind of despair, clinging to the state form of government of the world in which they lived before, people established a Congress and Boyle, the ship's doctor, was elected president. The first meeting of the Congress took place in a large hut, specially built for this purpose. The members of Congress squatted along the walls, while Boyle, the chairman of the High Assembly, stood importantly in the middle. Hawkins involuntarily grinned into his mustache, noting the doctor's nakedness and his pompous solemnity, which in no way correlated with each other. "Ladies and gentlemen," this is how Boyle began his throne speech. Hawkins looked at the lady's pale, unpainted lips and chuckled inwardly. "Ladies and gentlemen," repeated the doctor. "We, as you know, have been elected as representatives of human society on this planet. I propose that at this first meeting we discuss our chances of survival not so much as individuals, but as a whole as a human race. I would like to ask Mr. Hawkins, what are our chances of getting out of here?" One woman shouted from her seat, a member of Congress, a dry old maid with ribs and vertebrae showing through. "Almost none," answered Hawkins. "As you know, a ship during a flight from one star to another loses all contact with other systems. And then when we lost our course and had to make an emergency landing, although we sent a distress signal, we could not report our coordinates because we ourselves did not know where we had gone. Moreover, we don't even know if anyone received our signal." "Miss Taylor, and you, Mr. Hawkins," Boyle interrupted irritably, "forced to remind you that I am the chairman here and did not give you a word. Then we will have time for a debate on general issues. As most of us understand," the doctor continued his speech, "the age of this planet corresponds to the age of the Earth of the Carboniferous period. It has been established that no living creatures that threaten our existence yet live here. Of course, by the time such species appear, something like the giant dinosaurs of the Triassic period, we need to strengthen our position. By then we will already be in the grave." A man shouted. "That's true, we, of course, will die," the doctor agreed. "But our descendants will most likely live in good health, so we must decide now how to provide them with as many advantages as possible. the language we bequeath to them. Doc, about the language later, shouted another woman, a small, slender blonde with a determined expression on her face. The question of offspring is what we must decide now. I represent women who are capable of giving birth, as we know there are 15 of them. Tell me, can you, as a doctor, guarantee remembering that there are no medications or appropriate instruments that the birth will go well? All the pomp fell off Boyle like a worn-out toga. I'll be frank, he began. I have, as you, Miss Hart, correctly noted, neither medicine nor instruments. But I assure you, Miss Hart, the chances that the birth will take place normally without harm to health are much greater here than it was on Earth, say, in the 18th century. I'll tell you why. There are no microbes on this planet that are dangerous to humans. If they were, most of us would have died from sepsis long ago. I haven't said everything yet, said the blonde. There's one more point. There are 53 of us in the colony, women and men. Of these, 10 couples are legally married. We will not talk about them. 33 people remain, 20 of them men. 20 versus 13, as you can see, women are not always unlucky. Of course, we are not all young and charming, but we are all women. So, what form of marriage will we establish? Monogamy or polyandry? Of course, monogamy, exclaimed a tall, thin man, the only person wearing what looked like a loincloth made from fern leaves. Well, so be it, said the blonde. Monogamy is monogamy. I'm for this myself. But won't such a marriage cause any excesses? A woman can just as easily end up as a victim of murder due to jealousy, just like a man, and I wouldn't want that. What do you suggest in this case, Miss Hart? Asked Boyle. Because, Doc, since we are talking about marriage for the purpose of procreation, then love must be discarded as an unnecessary attribute. If two men claim the same woman, then let them settle the dispute by combat. The winner gets the woman, and she stays with him forever. Natural selection, then, muttered the doctor. Well, I'm not against it, but your proposal will have to be put to a general vote. At the top of the hill, not far from the camp, there was a small hollow, something like a natural amphitheater. The audience sat around the edges while 4 people remained on the stage itself. One of them was Boyle. He discovered, to his displeasure, that his functions as head of state also included the duties of a sports judge. In general opinion, he was better than anyone else in judging when a fight should be stopped so that none of the fighters became permanently crippled. Blonde Mary Hart was also there. In her hands she held a wreath of some yellow flowers with which she was going to crown the winner. It's a pity that this brainless mold ate all our watches, said the fat man sitting to Hawkins' left, otherwise we could have marked the rounds like in a real boxing match. Hawkins nodded his head and looked at the 4 people in the center of the arena, the blonde looking around proudly, the old doctor full of self-satisfaction, and 2 men whose faces were covered with thick beards and their naked bodies sparkled white. He knew both, Fennett, a junior officer from the Polar Star, and Clemens, a geologist of newly developed planets. If we had money, I'd bet on Clemens, said the fat man cheerfully. Your officer has as much chance of winning as there is snow in hell on a hot July afternoon. He is accustomed to a fair fight, and Clemens is accustomed to fighting with tricks. Fennett is in the best shape, Hawkins noted. He does morning exercises every day, and your Clemens only knows what to eat and sleep. Look at his belly. So don't bite and don't scratch out your eyes, the doctor declared impressively. And may the best man win. He stepped back, as he thought, gracefully and stood next to Miss Hart. With their hands down and fists clenched, the fighters stood facing each other in obvious embarrassment. Both seemed to regret that things had gone so far. Well, start, Mary Hart screamed, unable to bear it. Otherwise you'll grow old as a bachelor. It's okay, they'll wait until your daughter grows up, Mary, shouted one of her friends. If I ever have one. And at this rate there are not many chances. Start, the crowd shouted in unison. Fennett was the first to move. He somehow timidly stepped forward and lightly hit Clemens in the face with his right hand. The blow was weak, but apparently painful. Clemens raised his hand to his nose and, seeing blood on it, moved towards Fennett with the clear intention of grabbing him and breaking him. The officer jumped back and hit the geologist 2 more times. Why doesn't he give it a good shake? Exclaimed the fat man. To knock out your fingers? You see, they fight without gloves, Hawkins replied. Fennett decided to meet the enemy directly. He stopped, legs slightly apart, and struck again with his right hand. Hawkins noted with surprise that the geologist withstood the blow well. He's a lot tougher than he looks, Hawkins thought. Meanwhile, Fennett, performing a feint, slipped on the wet grass and fell. Clemens leaned heavily on him, but Fennett contrived sharply hit the geologist in the groin. He, groaning in pain, grabbed the officer's face with his fingers. "Don't touch your eyes?" Dr. Boyle, who was carefully watching the battle, shouted. He threw himself on his knees and grabbed Clemens' hand wide as a shovel with his hands. At that moment, Hawkins heard some extraneous sound. It was difficult to make out amid the screams of the fans, but the first mate thought it was coming from above. Hawkins raised his head and saw an unknown device, similar to a helicopter, hovering over the clearing. There were noticeable oddities in its design, and Hawkins immediately realized that the device was clearly alien. Meanwhile, a dimly metallic net fell out of the smoothly polished bottom of the apparatus and instantly entangled both struggling men as well as Dr. Boyle, Mary Hart, and Miss Taylor. Jumping to his feet, Hawkins rushed to help his comrades, but the net, as if alive, wrapped itself around his arms and legs. Several more people rushed to help Hawkins, but he shouted, "Back! Everyone back! Get away, run away!" The dull hum of the rotors of the device turned into a sharp whistle, and the machine began to go upward. In the blink of an eye, the hollow shrank to the size of a tea saucer, the apparatus dived into the clouds, and nothing became visible except the swaying dense whiteness. When the device finally landed, Hawkins was not at all surprised to see the glittering silver tower of a large spaceship which rose in the middle of the plateau. The planet to which they were brought would have seemed much more pleasant than the one they had left, if not for the excessive and therefore strange care of their new owners. The cage in which the three men were placed replicated with amazing accuracy the climatic conditions of the planet where the polar star died. The walls of the cage were glazed, and a light rain constantly flowed from the sprinklers on the ceiling. Two sad tree ferns standing in a cage provided no shelter from this unpleasant precipitation. Twice a day, a large hatch was opened in the corner of a cage made of something like concrete, and pieces of mushrooms were thrown in for them to eat after the shipwreck. On the opposite side of the chamber there were several more cells. One of them contained Mary Hart. Being, like the men, behind glass, she could communicate with them only through gestures and facial expressions. In the next cage there was an unknown animal, something like a cross between a lobster and a cuttlefish. It was not possible to find out where Miss Taylor was kept. Sitting on the wet floor, Hawkins, Boyle, and Fennett looked through thick glass and strong bars at the strange creatures that were looking at them. Oh, if only these were humanoids. Dr. Boyle sighed. If they were at least a little like us, then we could somehow explain ourselves and convince them that we are the same intelligent beings as they are. Unfortunately, they are not at all like us, Hawkins responded. In such a situation, we would also hardly believe that these six-legged beer barrels that stand on the other side of the bars are our brothers in mind. What and how to convince them? Maybe start with math? Come on, try the Pythagorean theorem. Hawkins turned to his junior officer. Unfortunately, they are not at all like us, Hawkins responded. In such a situation, we would also hardly believe that these six-legged beer barrels that stand on the other side of the bars are our brothers in mind. What and how to convince them? Maybe start with math? Come on, try the Pythagorean theorem. Hawkins turned to his junior officer. Without much enthusiasm, Fennett broke off several branches from the tree closest to them and, breaking them into several pieces, began to lay out a right triangle with squares on the sides on the damp floor. The natives, one large, another smaller, the third very small, looked indifferently with expressionless eyes at Fennett's manipulations. The larger one put one of its tentacles in his pocket. These creatures, it turns out, wore clothes. And taking out some kind of decorated bag from there, he gave it to the baby. He tore off the wrapper from the bag and stuffed the filling into a gap either on the muzzle or on the face, which apparently served as a mouth. And he began to chew. Probably there were native sweets in the bag. I wish they were allowed to feed the animals sitting in cages, Hawkins said with a sigh. Because these damned mushrooms make me really sick. Well, let's sum it up, said Dr. Boyle. So, the six of us were caught and dragged out of the camp in some kind of helicopter, brought to a spaceship which, it seems to me, is not particularly different from our interstellar liners. You, Hawkins, claim that they have Erie and Hort engines on their ship, at least similar to them, like two peas in a pod. That's absolutely true, confirmed the first mate. On the ship we were placed separately in different cells. No quarantines, fed and watered regularly. And then they were taken to this unknown planet. Here they were hastily driven, like cattle, from cages into an open van and driven, where we do not know. Finally, the van stopped, the doors opened, two natives, if these walking barrels can be called that, put hooks and nets into the van and pulled out Clemens and Miss Taylor. We haven't seen them since then. We were marinated for a day in separate cells, then sent to this cabinet of curiosities. Do you think that Clemens and Miss Taylor were vivisected? Asked Fennett. It's a shame I didn't like Clemens, but this. I'm afraid so, Boyle answered. Our jailers found out in this way that we differ in gender. Unfortunately, vivisection cannot determine whether a subject is intelligent. Those bastards! Exclaimed the junior officer. Keep it down, son, Hawkins said. You can't blame them for that, you know? We subject animals to anatomical studies that are much more similar to us than we are to these creatures. Our task, Dr. Boyle continued his thought, is to convince these creatures, as you called them, Hawkins, that we are the same intelligent beings as they are, that we have intelligence. But how to do this is the question. How can we prove to them that we have intelligence? Who do we call intelligent? The one who knows the Pythagorean theorem, Fennett muttered gloomily. I read somewhere that the history of mankind is the history of creatures who know how to make fire and make tools. Then let's light a fire, suggested the doctor. Or make some tools of production and start using them. Don't be a fool, the captain's first mate interrupted him. You know that we don't have the raw materials for this. We don't even have artificial teeth, everything was eaten by the damned mold. Hawkins thought for a minute. You know what, when I was young and handsome, all the cabin boys on the ship were taught various ancient crafts. We were considered the direct heirs of the sailors from the old sea sailing ships, so we were taught to tie sheets, weave ropes and mats, splice ends, light a fire, and much more. Then one of us got the idea to weave baskets. We then served on a passenger liner traveling from the Sun to Aldebaran. The baskets were woven in secret and, painted in unimaginably wild colors, were sold to simpleton passengers, passing off their creations as authentic products of natives from the distant planet Arcturus 6. What a scandal it was when the captain and first mate got wind of this. In short, where are you going with this? Asked the doctor. Here's where. We will show these creatures our dexterity and skill, our intelligence, when we weave baskets. I'll teach you. Perhaps this could work, Boyle said thoughtfully. Surely it could. However, remember, some species of animals also weave. Beavers, for example, are so clever at building their dams from willow twigs. And take the bowerbird, they are also called bowerbird because they begin to weave nests for themselves during the mating period. The chief curator of the Kunstkamera must have known about animals that, on the eve of mating, begin to weave nests, like bowerbird. At the end of the third day of frantic basket weaving, which consumed all the bedding, Mary Hart was transferred from her solitary confinement to a cage with 3 men. It's, of course, good that Mary was transferred to us, thought Hawkins. Another 2 or 3 days of solitary confinement and the poor thing would probably go crazy. However, keeping her in the same cage with men has its negative sides. Now we'll have to keep an eye on for young Fennett. And for the doctor, this old womanizer, you need an eye and an eye. In the middle of the night, Mary suddenly screamed. Hawkins was instantly overcome with sleep. He quickly stood up and approached the girl. What's the matter? What's happened? I don't know. It seemed to me that someone small with sharp claws ran over me. Ah, said Hawkins. This is our Joe. Joe? Asked Mary. What kind of Joe? It's such an animal, answered the first mate. Yes, something like our mouse, the doctor's voice came from the opposite corner. Usually it crawls out from somewhere at night in search of crumbs. Well, we started feeding him to tame him. You condone this abomination? Mary shouted. Catch her now. Now. I'm terribly afraid of mice. We'll catch it tomorrow, Hawkins said. Not now. Now. Mary insisted. I said tomorrow. Hawkins said harshly and went to his corner to get some sleep. Joe was caught very easily. They took 2 small baskets, fastened them together with loops, and it turned out to be an excellent mousetrap. They put bait inside, a large piece of mushroom. They skillfully placed a support so that it would immediately fall as soon as the animal touched the bait. Hawkins, lying awake on his wet mat, heard a quiet squeak and a dull thud, which told him that the mousetrap had slammed shut. Tiny claws scratched furiously along the strong walls of the basket, then the indignant squealing of the animal was heard. Perhaps this could work, Boyle said thoughtfully. Surely it could. However, remember, some species of animals also weave. Beavers, for example, are so clever at building their dams from willow twigs. And take the bowerbird, they are also called bowerbird because they begin to weave nests for themselves during the mating period. The chief curator of the Kunstkamera must have known about animals that, on the eve of mating, begin to weave nests, like bowerbird. At the end of the third day of frantic basket weaving, which consumed all the bedding, Mary Hart was transferred from her solitary confinement to a cage with 3 men. It's, of course, good that Mary was transferred to us, thought Hawkins. Another 2 or 3 days of solitary confinement and the poor thing would probably go crazy. However, keeping her in the same cage with men has its negative sides. Now we'll have to keep an eye on for young Fennett. And for the doctor, this old womanizer, you need an eye and an eye. In the middle of the night, Mary suddenly screamed. Hawkins was instantly overcome with sleep. He quickly stood up and approached the girl. What's the matter? What's happened? I don't know. It seemed to me that someone small with sharp claws ran over me. Ah, said Hawkins. This is our Joe. Joe? Asked Mary. What kind of Joe? It's such an animal, answered the first mate. Yes, something like our mouse. The doctor's voice came from the opposite corner. Usually it crawls out from somewhere at night in search of crumbs. Well, we started feeding him to tame him. You condone this abomination? Mary shouted. Catch her now. Now. I'm terribly afraid of mice. We'll catch it tomorrow, Hawkins said. Not now. Now. Mary insisted. I said tomorrow. Hawkins said harshly and went to his corner to get some sleep. Joe was caught very easily. They took 2 small baskets, fastened them together with loops, and it turned out to be an excellent mousetrap. They put bait inside, a large piece of mushroom. They skillfully placed a support so that it would immediately fall as soon as the animal touched the bait. Hawkins, lying awake on his wet mat, heard a quiet squeak and a dull thud, which told him that the mousetrap had slammed shut. Tiny claws scratched furiously along the strong walls of the basket, then the indignant squealing of the animal was heard. Chandler Bertram. The Cage. Bertram Chandler. Cell. This text is read by Gary Crewe. Dear friends, if you like what I do, please subscribe to my channel, click like, leave comments, click on the bell so you don't miss new stories. You can support the channel and hear new works by subscribing first to my Patreon, links in the description. Your help is very important to me. Thank you very much for your attention.